Hey, church family, here we are again. It's week 2 of doing church at home, and hope y'all are doing well. I hope everyone is staying healthy and you're making the most of these difficult circumstances. And I know this isn't ideal for us to do church this way, but I am thankful for the technology that allows us to stay connected and for me to be able to bring you a word of encouragement from God's Word, which is what I'd like to do today. And so the word I'd like to bring to you is actually from Matthew chapter 17. If you've got a Bible or a device near you, go ahead and go to Matthew chapter 17. You know, it's been said that great fishermen have great fishing stories, and that is certainly the case for Peter, the disciple of Jesus. I don't know if he was a great fisherman, but he's got some great fishing stories, and I'd like to look at one of those stories with you today. This story is actually surrounded by a couple of other stories that highlight the disciples' small faith and their large egos. In fact, just before this story, Jesus rebukes them. They couldn't cast out a demon because Jesus says, "Your faith, it's too small." And then immediately following this story, the disciples ask the question, who's the greatest? And that's where we find this very unusual fishing story. And so let me share this story with you. Matthew chapter 17, looking at verse 24. After Jesus and his disciples arrived in Capernaum, the collectors of the 2 drachma tax came to Peter and asked, "Doesn't your teacher pay the temple tax?" Now, these aren't Roman tax collectors. These are actually Jewish tax collectors, and they were collecting taxes for the temple. And this would be a once-a-year gathering where they would come out and gather this tax from men of 20 years of age or older. It was basically 2 days' wages. And they're asking Peter about Jesus, hey, does he pay this tax? And they're actually asking him to affirm it. They're basically saying, he does pay this tax, doesn't he? To which Peter replies, yeah, he does. And so, of course, the only way Peter would know that is if Peter watched him pay it in previous years, or if Peter asked him, or if Jesus told him. But Peter says, yeah, he pays the temple tax. And so Peter goes back into the house, and Jesus immediately asks him a question in regard to this temple tax. And Jesus' teachable moment is this. When Peter came into the house, Jesus was the first to speak. And of course, you know that's hard with Peter to be the first to speak, but Jesus beat him to the punch. And what do you think, Simon? He asked. From whom do the kings of the earth collect duty and taxes? From their own sons or from others? And so there are these kings of the earth, these rulers, and they go out and collect taxes. But who do they collect the taxes from? Do they collect it from their own family members? Or do they collect it from other people, other families? And from others, Peter answered. They don't collect from their own children. Their children are essentially exempt, is what Jesus wants him to realize. Then the sons are exempt, Jesus said to him. And I just want to pause there for a moment, because why is Jesus bringing this up, that they're exempt? I think he's bringing it up to let him know that Jesus is not obligated to pay this tax. This is a temple tax, and after all, Jesus' Father's house is the temple. He's the Son of God. He's the Son of Man, and so he's not obligated to pay this. And I think he's even insinuating that Peter is not obligated to pay this tax either, because Peter's following Jesus and becoming a part of this kingdom of priests, this royal priesthood. He doesn't have to pay this tax. But Jesus says this, but so that we may not offend them. And I know when you first hear that word offend, you probably think, well, so we don't get them upset. But that's not really what this word means. In fact, most of the time this word is translated as so we don't cause them to sin. So we don't cause them to fall away, to go astray. That's what he's saying. If we were to refuse to pay this tax, we might cause our brothers to sin. right? Because maybe through their greed they would, use this money on other things. After all, we saw greed in the temple, right? That's where Jesus is turning over tables. My Father's house is to be a house of prayer. So we know that the Jewish men struggled with greed a bit. And he says, look, we don't want to cause them to stumble. And so even though we don't have to pay this tax, we're going to pay it. Now, here's where the story gets crazy. Here is where things get a little weird. Jesus comes up with a plan for Peter to gather the money to pay this tax, both for Peter and for Jesus. And here's the plan he comes up with. Go to the lake, throw out your line. Take the first fish you catch, open its mouth, and you will find a 4-drachma coin. And a 4-drachma coin would have been essentially 4 days' wages. It would have been sufficient for this temple tax. Take it and give it to them for my tax and yours. Now, before I get into that bizarre instruction for this fishing venture, let me just note that Jesus is encouraging Peter to not do something for the sake of others. He's saying, this is something you don't have to do, but I want you to do it anyway, for the sake of others. And essentially, we can probably relate to that right now, right? I mean, many of us are staying home, we are staying in, we're washing our hands, we're doing all these sanitary practices, essentially for the sake of others. We don't want the most vulnerable among us to be hurt by this virus. And so Jesus is saying, look, I know you don't have to pay this. I don't have to pay this, but we're going to do this because of others, for the sake of others. And so essentially it's laying down, it's surrendering your freedom to prevent a brother from stumbling, which is a very biblical idea. In fact, Paul writes about this in Romans 14, where he says, let us therefore make every effort to do what leads to peace and mutual edification. Do not destroy the work of God for the sake of food. All food is clean, but it's wrong for a person to eat anything that causes someone else to stumble. It's better not to eat meat or drink wine or do anything else that will cause your brother or sister to fall. And so Jesus sees the wisdom here. We don't want to cause these men to stumble or fall or go astray. And so we're going to pay this tax even though we don't have to. And so Jesus has this plan. Peter, take your line, catch a fish. The first one you catch, open its mouth. There's going to be a coin in it. Take that coin and go and pay my obligation and yours. Now you might be thinking, that seems a little odd. Like, why not just go to the purse and grab a coin out of it, or go ask somebody for a coin, or pull the old magician's trick and pull one out of Peter's ear and get, like, why are we having him go catch a fish, go open its mouth, and do this strange instruction here? And so I want to give you just 3 possible reasons why God might ask us to do something unusual. Because I do believe God asks us to do unusual things at times. And let me be honest, there's a difference between God asking us to do something unusual and God asking Peter to do something unusual. With Peter, he could look at Jesus, he could hear Jesus' voice and look him in the eye and maybe even ask for points of clarification. Now, with you and I, when we're trying to discern the voice of God, we're trying to make sense. Is this weird thing that I'm prompted with? Is this just my crazy idea? Or is God speaking something to me? And so there's a little bit more discernment that has to take place. But I would suggest to you that God is going to ask you to do things at times that maybe don't make sense to you, or maybe don't make sense to family members or friends, things that are unusual, things that you would say, Jesus, if I was going to do this, I wouldn't do it this way. Like, this is just weird. And after all, we don't want people to think that we're weird. But Jesus asked Peter to do something really weird. And I want to share with you 3 reasons why God might do that, why he might ask you to do something unusual. The first is to test your obedience. Are you going to do this, or are you going to ask me a bunch of questions? Are you going to tell me why you're not qualified, or why this is silly and you don't need to do this? Are you going what's your response going to be to my instruction? Jesus could simply be testing obedience. Now, the assumption here is that Peter simply obeyed and did what Jesus asked him to do. We're not told that he didn't, and so we assume Peter did what Jesus asked. And so Jesus may be testing Peter's obedience, and God may do that with us. He may ask us to do something unusual just to see if we're obedient, to see if we're actually going to do it. I did this with Julius just this past week. He had on these shoes that were a little silly and not appropriate for going outside. And I just said, buddy, why don't you put on your tennis shoes? And of course, what did he do? He argued with me. Why do I have to do that? And then I just told him, I just want to see if you'll obey, right? I just want to see if you'll follow your father's instruction. Just simple obedience, Julius. But I think that's our tendency. That's our immediate response, is to argue with God and to try using logic and reason. But what we're going to see is this doesn't follow logic or reason. And the only appropriate response when being instructed by the Lord is just obedience. And so maybe he's testing our obedience. Has God done that for you? I think one of the greatest tests of obedience for me was when God asked me to go to Lincoln Christian College and train to become a preacher at 24 years old. I had a job I enjoyed. I had a house that I liked. Things were going well for me. I thought I was on a trajectory for a career as a truck driver. And then in the midst of all of this, I sensed God saying, I want you to pack up your bags and move to Lincoln and go train to be a preacher. And I thought, that seems bizarre. I'm not a preacher's kid. I didn't even grow up being a good kid, and is this really what you want me to do, or is this just another crazy idea? But through some discernment with the Holy Spirit, I sensed that this was God's idea, and so I followed that. And I hope that obedience led to future steps of obedience. Heard a story through a blog that I was reading, and this blog is titled Cultivating Authentic Faith in the Home, and the writer is Christy Thomas. She's the author of this blog. And she shares that on March 21st of 2018, she went to a hospital and a surgeon cut out her left kidney and gave it to a complete stranger. And why would she do that? She says, because I believe God wanted me to. She doesn't know exactly why she was doing this, but she felt like God was asking her to give a kidney. Can you imagine if God asked you to do that? Would you do that? That seems crazy and unusual. And she doesn't exactly know what the implications of that is. She doesn't know exactly who benefited from that, but I admire her just simple obedience to the voice of God. And so one reason may be to test our obedience. The second reason may be it just simply allows God to show off. And if you've been walking with God for very long, you know He likes to show off. It brings Him glory. Just showing off like on the day of Pentecost where some backwoods fishermen begin speaking fluently in foreign languages. Can you imagine? This is like Larry the Cable Guy speaking French. How could you watch that with a straight face? You would be like them and you'd accuse him of being drunk, this is just weird. But if God is the one doing it, He's the one that gets the glory, and He likes to show off. That's what God often does. And so He may ask you to do something unusual, maybe just to show off to you or to show off to the witnesses so that He can be glorified through that. But parents, you do this. You show off for your children all the time, right? You lower that basketball hoop to 8 foot so you can show your kids that you can dunk, right? We've all done that, and the kids clap and they praise and they think that you're awesome. Here recently, I've been recording some videos on YouTube, and my son Julius, he thinks I'm a celebrity. He says, Dad, you're a YouTuber? And I'm like, yeah, I'm a YouTuber. And at his age, that's like amazing, right? And so I show off for my kids all the time. And you want their praise and their admiration. And our Heavenly Father is the same way. He shows off. He wants our praise and our admiration. And He might ask us to do some unusual things just so He can show off. The third and final reason is that it will strengthen our faith and the faith of others. When we see God showing up in these miraculous ways and these unusual circumstances, we realize God is capable of anything, that with Him all things really are possible. Remember, I said this story falls in between the small faith of the disciples and the big ego of the disciples. I don't know about you, but that's where I live most of the time. And sometimes God just needs to come along and strengthen our faith so it can at least get to the size of a mustard seed, that we can just trust Him in those hard times, in times like this. And so when God asks us to do unusual things and He shows up and He does wild and amazing work, then our faith is strengthened. And not only is our faith strengthened, but the people that witness this, the people that hear this fishing story, their faith is strengthened. I was at a conference not long ago where I got to hear from missionaries and church planners about how they just got started in planning their churches or starting their missions organizations. And time again, I remember thinking, these people are crazy. The risks that they're taking is just so wild. But they all kind of shared this sense that it was God asking them to do this. And yes, they took big risk, but they also benefited from big kingdom rewards. And what happened is, as we're listening to these stories, our faith is being strengthened. We're being inspired to serve God even more faithfully, even more boldly. And that's what can happen when we do unusual things and watch God do what God does. And so those are a few reasons why God might ask us to do something unusual. And so it's got me thinking just a couple of questions. Does God give faith tests to determine our future assignments? Does God test our faith? He's just seeing if you'll do this, then maybe I'll give you a bigger and bolder assignment. If you'll be faithful with this small thing, then I'll entrust you with something much larger, much more significant. If that's the case, if God is giving us these small faith tests just to see if we'll do it, then how are we doing at those faith tests? Because James says that these faith tests, it develops perseverance, right? And so God's saying, if you'll do this, then I'll give you something even bigger, even bolder. Right now, Jesus is asking Peter to go catch a fish. Soon, of course, Jesus' ultimate plan is for him to not be a fisher of fish, but a fisher of men. And at the day of Pentecost, Peter catches 3,000 men. They're baptized because of a sermon that he preaches. And so I think throughout the Gospels, we see their faith being built and strengthened, but I also see their obedience being tested. And they're passing some of these tests of obedience. Some of these tests, I'll just be honest, I probably wouldn't pass. Okay? And so I'm asking, is God giving out those tests? And if He is, are we obeying? Or are we just quick to dismiss, this is bizarre, this is unusual, this is not what God's asking me to do, and we're appealing to logic and reason to justify, quite frankly, our disobedience? Second question is this: Does God do hearing checks? I was thinking about this as I was out for my run earlier this week. Does God do hearing checks? You probably know this. If you've been walking with the Lord for a while, there are some people that seem to have good listening ears to the voice of God. Some people that are just more in tune with His voice than others. And I always wanted to be one that just had that frequency down. But I feel like often I'm just deaf. I just can't hear, that God has to shout for me to hear. But is it possible that God is just checking the microphone, just testing to see, can you hear me? Are you listening? Or do you just have all this other noise that's drowning out my voice and you have no idea what I'm saying? Does God do that? And if He does He do this hearing check? Does He check our listening to determine our future works? That if you can hear me asking you this, then I know you're going to hear me to ask you this. And it increases as God continues speaking, and we begin to recognize His voice quicker, and it's louder, and it's stronger, and we're faster to obey. And God is being glorified through our lives as we take those steps of obedience and as we continue following the voice of God. Now, in recent headlines, I was intrigued by a story about Hobby Lobby. Maybe you heard this story, maybe you read about it, but Hobby Lobby was given a lot of flack for keeping some of their stores open during this time, although I think many, if not all, have closed at this point. But I wasn't so much intrigued by them keeping their stores open as I was hearing about why they did this. And this was a memo written to the Hobby Lobby employees by its owner, David Green. And he wrote, in my family, Barbara, and that's his wife, Barbara is the prayer warrior. I've never been accused of being a prayer warrior, but I've met a few prayer warriors. But I was intrigued that the owner of Hobby Lobby, obviously a very successful, multi-billion-dollar company, the spouse is considered to be a prayer warrior. And he says, in her quiet time this past week, the Lord put on Barbara's heart. And that's often how the Lord communicates with us, not through obvious audible means like Peter, but by putting something on our heart. The Lord put on Barbara's heart 3 profound words to remind us that He is in control. Guide, guard, and groom. We serve a God who will guide us through this storm, who will guard us as we travel to places never seen before, and who is, as a result of this experience, will groom us to be better than we could ever have thought possible before now. And it just got me wondering, has Barbara passed those hearing tests? Has she been listening to the voice of God over the span of decades, and that's why their company is as successful as it is, and that's why they're able to go up to the very Supreme Court of our nation and win? Right? I mean, maybe there are people like that God is just testing. Can you hear me? Will you obey me? Can you hear me? Will you obey me? Listen to me and obey me. Right before this text, Peter, James, and John were taken up on a mountain. And God the Father shows up and He declares, "This is my Son, whom I love. With Him I am well pleased." Then He says this, and He's saying this to Peter, James, and John. He's saying this to you and me. Listen to Him. Listen to Him. And so is God doing hearing checks? Is He asking us to listen to Him? And in doing so, He's going to ask us to do some unusual things. Now, not everything about this story is unusual. Maybe I should point that out. Jesus didn't ask him to go climb a tree or plant a vineyard or go, on a hike in the woods. He asked him to go catch a fish. Peter's a fisherman. He can catch a fish. This is actually what he does best. This is his job. This is what he would normally do. Go take your line, catch a fish. I can handle that, Jesus. Right? And so I think often God asks us to do the things that we're good at, the things that we're familiar with, the things that are just ordinary tasks for us, but He does extraordinary things in the midst of it. As you go and just do your normal work, go to your job, go and write, go and teach, go and preach, go and do whatever it is that God's called you to do. You do what you do, and you watch God do what He does. Because when you're listening, when you're obeying, even when God asks you to do these unusual, seemingly bizarre things, He's going to show up and He's going to do some great and amazing work. Now, there's one more fishing story I'd like to share with you. And this happens, John records this at the end of his gospel. This is after Jesus has risen from the dead. He said, "Hey, go to Galilee. I'm going to meet with you." They're out there. They decide, Peter decides actually, "I'm going to go fishing." So they say, "We'll go with you." So they go out into the boat. They start fishing. And they're fishing all night and they get skunked, which there's nothing worse for a fisherman than it gets skunked when you go fishing. I mean, these are pros, right? And they're probably hungry and tired, and we got nothing. And all of a sudden, some guy from the shore says, "Hey, you catching anything?" Now, that's the worst question you can ask a bunch of skunked fishermen. "No, we're not catching anything. We've been out here all night." And he says, "Try the right side." Now, what's amazing is they actually do it. Maybe they're like, "What do we got to lose?" They throw it over to the right side. And wouldn't you know it, their nets get so full that they start to break. And John connected 2 and 2. Like, no catch like this happens unless God in the flesh commands these fish to get into these nets, right? The one who controls the waves of the sea, the one that controls all of creation. And so John makes the connection. He says, "It is the Lord." And of course, Peter jumps out and Jesus says, "Hey, bring the fish in." And John lets us know there's 153 large fish. And so here they are doing what they normally do, going out to fish. And Jesus asks them to do something. Hey, throw it over to the right side. Simple obedience. They throw it over to the right side, and look what happens. Gigantic catch, a catch of all catches, a story for future fishing stories. They're doing what they do, and God does what He does. And so that's my word of encouragement to send you with today. That is, God is asking you to do something that seems unusual, bizarre, just kind of out of left field. Don't quickly dismiss it. Pay attention, discern that voice, because if it is the voice from the Lord, and you just go about doing what you're doing, listening and obeying, God is going to do what He does. And it's going to strengthen your faith, and it's going to strengthen the faith of those around you.